Friday the 28th, environmental art, earthworks, earth art, ecological art, reviewing the emergence of art in the environment. The moderator is Susan Botker, who has a new book on the subject and will have some copies that night. The panelists include Virginia Devon, who's a dealer and patron, John Gibson, who's a dealer, Dennis Oppenheim, an artist, Willoughby Sharp, a lecturer and dealer. That's the 28th here. Next week is one of our favorite events every year. Sometimes we do two, some years we do one. It's an open screening. Anybody can show their work. $5, 5 slides, 5 minutes. And there are a few people here tonight that have done that, so you know it's a nice experience. You get to see new work. You also get a very gentle interpretation or reaction to your own work. I highly recommend it if you haven't experienced it before. And now I'd like to introduce Molly Barnes to introduce tonight's panel.
Hello, everyone. I'm Molly Barnes. Welcome to a really exciting show tonight. Fran, where are you? Fran Kornfeld and I, Fran came up with this idea. She had been to Gallery 18, a wonderful gallery which is owned by Franz, on Warren Street in Tribeca, and seen a show called Gallery Wheat, which was a gallery in Paris that existed for 2 years, and so many artists, in addition to the ones who were up here tonight, the 3 artists showed there during a very brief time. Tovich, George Ortman, Sam Francis, Al Hell, Jules Olitsky, Herb Gentry, Larry Calgano. It was just an amazing group of people, a great synergism, and unfortunately it did not last. It was just after World War II. So tonight we're going to show 10 minutes of a film, sort of a home film that was made, showing 2 of these artists and sort of the environment of the day. It's it's really a home movie. It's kind of hard to see, but maybe we can kind of gather around this monitor to watch it. Then I'll introduce each of the panelists who will talk for 5 minutes with their slides. Then I'll ask some questions, and then we'll leave it open to you to ask questions. I'm really glad you're all here tonight, and I'm looking forward to a great discussion. You might have to get up and stand around, those of you, Steve, Joe. more of that, you'll have to buy the tape from France. Anyway, tonight we have three wonderful artists, and then Franz will talk about how he got the idea for the show. First is
Bert Hassan.
Bert Hassan, who for years was a teacher at SVA, also showed with Anita Shapolsky. He will talk to us and show slides. Then we have Jonah, who you just saw, who I think you all know his work. My favorite thing I saw, well, he reminded me tonight, I saw his work around Soho and called him a number of years ago and asked him to bring me some work. And tonight I got a piece, Duchamp in the center, and a satire, a wonderful, wonderful kind of cartoon about how the art world was changed as a result of Duchamp. Then we have Sidney Geist, who you saw was kind of in shadow, who will talk about his work. So we'll start with Bert. Let's see. Okay, you're ready.
Well, it's an interesting experience. I look back and I was thinking about it, that who once really cares that much about what happened 50 years ago? I mean, really, you know, when you realize it's an awful long time ago. And I was thinking about how to formulate this and what I call the great exodus from America that took place from 1945, or began in 1945, and went right through until, I'd say, 1955, 1960. And I belong to the relatively early contingents. I arrived in Paris in 1948. Jonah next to me arrived about 1947, and Sydney arrived in 1948 as well. And we're relatively early contingent, even though they're earlier people than us. And I was trying to think about what I again call the great exodus. What happened? And I think I really determined it as being that most of us were men, because we were all ex-GIs. We all had been in the Army or the Navy or the Marines or whatever. And we were all ex-GIs, so that we had, before, in our early 20s, most of us had done a great deal of traveling. We had been everywhere. You know, those are the group who went to the South Pacific, those who went to Europe, those who went to Burma, those who went to, well, I mean, it was called the traveling. We were the great travelers. And when we got back to America, for some reason we were disenchanted with America. As if all of a sudden that desire for space again arrived, entered our soul, and we found America very confining, very, very domesticated, extremely conservative, but I don't think the conservatism is the right word, very confining. We felt basically out of place in America. And many, at least my contingency group, because you got to remember there were thousands of ex-soldiers and ex-GIs taking off from America. I belonged to the group that wanted to go to Paris. Now, I was a Francophile from my early teens, or rather my middle teens. So it really wasn't, the choices were not very difficult. And as it was, when I took 2 books with me when I took off for New Guinea, when I went overseas to the South Pacific, and one was Rimbaud's poetry, and the other was the first volume of Swann's Way by Marcel Proust. So you get an idea where I was. So going to Paris was a great idea. Besides, most of us had saved money during the war, because at least for those of us who were in the South Pacific, we had no place to spend it. Those in Europe the same way. So all our money that we had saved we used for our boat fare, and we all went over in this post-war period in troop ships that were non-converted. And most of us landed at Cherbourg. And of course that was the great life began, because I must admit to you the greatest moments of my life was my years in Paris in those early epics. And I imagine the same thing for everybody else that I know who was there at that time. It was the greatest moment in our lives. We were very carefree. We were so happy to be out of America and in Paris. I'll be honest with you, we just adored Paris, and we still do. I mean, I still do, because I've been back a lot since then. And we were away, and we were in the land that we loved. And all of us in our secret of hearts wanted to stay there and not come back to America. We were imbued with French culture, French cultural life, some of us more than others. In the literary factor, not that many, because I must admit a lot of the Americans could not speak French very well. Here and there were a few Americans, the literary people, who could speak better French than the painters and the sculptors, Americans who were quite poor. But we were all very knowledgeable what was happening in the French world, the art world, which was our dimension. Because remember, we had only been in America after being most of it 4 years overseas in the army. We come back to America, we're here for about a year and a half. We don't know as much as going on in New York art, really, be honest with you. I didn't know much was happening. Then we're off to Paris. So we knew more about what was going on in the art world in Paris than we knew was going on in America. And we were very much knowledgeable about the great masters, you know, Picasso, Matisse, etc. But we also we knew a lot about, at least I myself, about the artists who were less well known in America. I was thinking of people like Bazin, people like Manassier, people like Pignon. Then there was André Marchand, and I can name André Minot. I could name any number of painters that I knew more about than I knew what was going on in the U.S. I didn't know much about what was happening with terms of, you know, the abstract expressionists, nor that much about, you know, about people like Rothko and Klein and de Kooning. I knew about them to a certain degree, but for some reason, we were all very romantic. My generation, and there was a little bit older, because there were a little bit, some of us who were a little bit older, we were very romantic. We had very romantic, what you might call even old-fashioned visions of art. We loved people like Modigliani. We liked Jacques Lipchitz as a sculptor. We liked, and with disputes, of course, we liked Zadkine, a cubist, and a very good one at his best. And we liked Pevsner and Gabo and all those people. So that in a sense, we were very, I might say, we're very imbued in that universe of Paris. And we, many of us, we had the first Salon de Mai, or the second Salon de Mai. Many of us were in that show. And what happened was, I believe that there was a French writer, critic, who invited the Americans in Paris to show at the Salon de Mai, which is a very prestigious show, I must tell you. And I forget his name now. Not Pignon, the critic, and also a novelist. His name was not Carré. Anyway, he complained. He felt that the work that was being shown by the Americans at the Salon de Mai was not really representative of the best work that was being done by Americans. Meaning was, he had more esteem for the more mature guys like de Kooning and Klein and Pollock and all this than he had for us, which in a sense was understandable, because we were not very formed. We were in our middle 20s. What the hell did we really know? We were just at the beginning, where already the people like Klein, de Kooning, and Pollock were already 20 years our seniors. So in that respect, he was right. So we were annoyed by it at the time. We were annoyed by this statement, but now that I think back, it's justifiable. And in any case, it was a great event. And I do say that Paris in those days was great, because it was very inexpensive. If you had a few American dollars, we had $75 a month we got from the government, which didn't go very far, but when you consider you get a meal for $1 and a hotel room that wasn't too bad for $1, we managed to scrape by. And Paris was very much pre-war, meaning was there were very few cars. The cafes and restaurants were not fixed up. Nothing was being built. By the time I arrived in 1948, Paris was still very much pre-war. And all of us who came from 1945 to 1950 or so did not see the resurrection of French economic life until about 1950 it began, to a certain degree. So Paris was quiet, very few automobiles, and we had a great time. I mean, I can't say, I honestly wanted to stay there. Because being an ardent Francophile that I was, I wanted to stay in France. I wanted to elect it as my home. I didn't want to come back to America. I'll be honest with you. 'Cause
So
I
let's
got-
see some of your slides.
Yes, okay.
Okay.
Enough talk.
You want to describe it?
Yeah, this is a painting.
Do it in the mic.
These are pictures that were done relatively recently, I must admit, within the last 4 years, and they're my own cosmology, my own universe of a kind of like, it's hard to describe my work because they're like growing forms within a kind of framework of a kind of a landscape, which you might call, I was very much involved for years with aerial maps, so you might call it a kind of an aerial map with fragmentations, little fragmentations and elements that interlock with each other in a kind of a window kind of thing. And since they're non-figurative, they're not easy to describe. Okay, next one. This one is a painting of which is actually backwards, I must admit. It's backwards, this painting, but you can see it this way too, is done in 1996. And it's also an aerial map with fragmentations of forms moving off of them, off of that main central square. Fragments and energies and polyps and stuff like that, because I'm very much interested in insects and polyps and microbes and etc. So there's configuration of all these little growing forms flying all over the place. I like objects that fly all over the place. This one here too is also I think the wrong direction too, but it's still, with my work you can look at it, you know, reverse and so forth. This one, I mean, this one is also another example of a growth in the center and a kind of amorphous growing form in the center, that white plains on a kind of a land. I'm very interested in sand and land base. Very concerned with deserts and things like that. But next. This was another example of my floating forms on a kind of a desert formation. Also, you know, polyps and enigmatic forms. It's basically enigmatic, because I don't even know what the hell they are myself. It's basically, really, I don't. They're just enigmas. They're mysterious enigmas. And maybe that's all right. I think it's a good idea. What's wrong with it? Mysterious enigmas. And this one is an example of it, of the enigmatic elements interlocking themselves through the field itself. Okay. This was an earlier one, the same kind of a feeling, growth in earth forms and plant forms as well, that are veering off this square, this rectangle, and interlocking, and all this fragmentation around it is another example of my interest, which I'm interested, you know, in polyps, interested in underwater fishes of deep to down in the ocean. And this one is of the middle 90s, this one. Okay.
Is that it?
Yes, that's it.
Thank you.
All right.
Thank you, Bert. We'll get back to you in the discussion now. Jonah.
Yeah. Okay, the light's not gonna be on me, right? I gotta be in his position?
No, just.
Just sit there and use the
Spotlight's on the standing mic.
Yeah.
And use it then.
Maybe you want to stand up.
No, oh, I see what it is. The mic is in the right place. I'm in the wrong place.
Why don't you just stand up?
Why don't I just lower it so I don't have to stand? Is that all right?
Not quite. Lean forward because you're out of the light. Come forward a little bit.
How's this?
Forward towards the mic.
How about here? All right. Well, what Bert said, I guess, is more or less true. The experience in Paris was la vie bohème, after all. That's why we really went there, at least for me. It was la vie bohème, and it was getting away from the United States and going to a country that had all the art world in it. And it was as close as you can get to the art world is what I wanted to get at the time. And there was Picasso and Matisse and all the big names, Brock. And we loved being there. And we lived the life of an artist, at least what we thought artists should live. Addicts. We didn't have too much food, and I guess we were proud of that in a way, because artists should suffer, and I guess we suffered because of it. We liked that idea in a way, in spite of the fact of all the complaining. I mean, the more you suffered, the more you felt like the real, the truer artist you are. And as the years went by, we felt more and more at home in Paris. I was in Zatkin's class, and at the time I liked him. I was not one of his acolytes. I didn't hang around in the cafes with him, but he always did have quite a crowd around him. And it was a great time. And it was, if I had to put a title to it all, Great Expectations for everybody, that so few of us lived up to, unfortunately. So that's about it. Now,
Tell us about the gallery.
the Gallery Week?
Yes.
Well, it was a small gallery where Americans got together. They finally made a gallery after Rosenwald gave us the gallery. He used to live there and do sculpture. And it first started with a small group of guys who paid the rent. And later, there were many people who showed at the Gallery Week. And there were some critics that came down from the French newspapers, and they reported it. And there was Joseph Barry, who was working for the World Telegram at the time and brought Madame Toklas down. And there was a big crowd at the time. People couldn't even get into the gallery when she was there. There were great events at times.
You want to tell us about your paintings?
Sure. Oh, yeah. This is an early painting of mine.
You have to speak into the microphone.
Oh, yes, that's right. This is an early painting of mine, influenced by Soutine, clearly. And it's a cow's head. And he's been cut up. You can move on. This is a much later painting. This is a painting of the Jewish exodus over the bridge in Prague, the Charles Bridge. Okay. It's an anti-clerical painting of mine. It's a little different. Not so long ago. This is another anti-clerical painting done in a different style, earlier than the other one. Go ahead. Well, this is sort of a surrealist painting. It's a dream painting. It's from the cemetery in Prague, the very old cemetery, and it was in my mind that all these people rise out of the dead. It's like you might say, debout les morts, rise up, you dead. Go on. It's an anti-clerical painting. And this one is too.
What size are
This is about 4 feet by 5'6" Go on. Yeah, they're not that old. This one is just a conglomeration of ideas I had about Rome, the Forum in Rome, and the different figures that you find there that selling you something, sort of like half a marché aux puces, and different figures that come around and for different reasons. Okay. This is the Eternal Theologians. It's a picture of these figures I've dreamed up, arguing about what you might say is how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Okay. This is a painting of Coney Island and what's behind it. In other words, there is the part hotel, part the Dodgem cars, and then there's the fun houses, the Devil's Dominion. Could you clear this up any further? Sharpen it? Yeah, that's it. And the figures in the foreground, I wanted them to meld in with the figures that have been painted on this marquee in the back, so that you almost can't tell them apart from the real figures in the front. Okay. There's a dream scene. It's made up, I just dreamed it up, you know. Figures in the Roman Forum. Okay. This is the Temptations of St. Anthony.
Were you ever arrested for any of these?
Not yet. Next one. Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. No.
That was great. Thank you. Now, Sydney Guys. Sydney, you have to stand up, I'm afraid.
Like my two friends who just
Raise it up from the bottom, slide it, turn it from the bottom.
Maybe I could give you, what about taking this one here?
good. Like my two friends, I was drawn to Paris for simply romantic reasons. Nothing in the world could match the reputation of Paris for me as an artist. I used to read Parisian art newspapers when I went to school in upstate New York. I prepared myself for France by reading French, looking up every word. I pasted those letters on the outside of the dictionary so I could get to a letter I wanted faster. I wore out my dictionary with these letters. I eventually tear the pages and put new ones on. Anyway, France and Paris was a dream that, well, finally came true. And when I got back, it took me years, I must say, to get Paris out of my mind and to get used to living in New York. Life was so sweet there. The streets and business of living was all human scaled. I remember once I came out of the studio where I was working. I'd been cutting stone and went to the bakery on the street to get some loaf of bread for lunch. And as the woman behind the counter handed it to me, she said, "Ah, vous êtes sculpteur." She saw the dust, stone dust on my arm, and she interpreted it like that and said, "You're a sculptor." Well, I was trying to be a sculptor, and here was a French woman, you know, calling me a sculptor. And they were glorious days because we were all young and full of energy, and we just, you know, come off war duty, and we all worked. I mean, no matter how much time we spent living in Paris and enjoying Paris, we all did a lot of work. I did an enormous amount of work. And I was so grateful for this experience of Paris that the night before I left, I wrote a letter of thanks to a critic who'd indeed written about Gallery 8, thanking him for, I mean, to be the recipient of thanks, you know, for my wonderful experience of living and making art in Paris.
So why don't you tell us about the work?
Yeah. I've chosen pieces that had to do with Gallery 8. I was enrolled in Zadkin's class at the Académie de la Grande Chaumière. As an ex-GI, I had to go to school, huh? and so I signed up with Zadkin, and that meant working from the model. And we had a model every day, and well, when I was in the morning working from the model, I did a rather realistic study. Then I'd come in the afternoon and make something like this, which was not done in front of the model. It was done from memory and my study if I kept it. Zadkin would, for instance, I remember in this case, he had a model, a nude model, sit in front of a table, and he put all kinds of things on the table, a bottle, pictures, spoons, a book, you know, and I just chose a little cup like this. It's a quite cubist thing. Oh, it was about this big. And the clay was easy to get, and the firing of it was easy to accomplish and was cheap. I actually showed this at Gallery 8. Next slide. I did those terracottas. Can I sit down? Good.
Slightly turn forward so you're in the light, please.
Yeah. I did the terracottas like the one you just saw for about a year. I think there are 29 or 30 of them. And then toward the end of the year, I had some kind of impulse I wanted, well, these terracottas, you know, they look like, they have a very traditional look, almost anything made in terracotta. But I wanted to do something that would be expressive of Paris, something witty, or I don't know what, but something that was maybe like an homage to Paris. And I dreamed up these things. As you see, there's a little chunk of wood for a base, and the wire is piano wire, very tense, very hard. And the objects are in balsa wood, very light. So these are kind of, they were like the reverse of a Calder sculpture, huh? Instead of hanging. And if there was any movement in the room, in the shelf, they shimmied a little bit, or shivered, you know. They were rather enlarged on the screen. They were about this big, about 2/3 the size you see. Next. This was another one. These things brought Zotkin's ire again on me. He, in teaching, he referred to some early experiences with his own work when critics had said, his work is merely novel, merely new, merely, he said, try and do something merely new, he would say to us. And these things were rather new. And, and they got shown. Gallery Met had a kind of junior gallery downtown somewhere in Paris, and put them in the window. And Zotkin, well, when he walked around giving his critique in the class, one day there were a couple of little shreds of balsa underfoot, and he kicked them, and he said, can't you clean up after your work? I mean, I was the only one who swept up the place. I didn't work there, but I did sweep up before the class to be more comfortable. I missed a little shred of balsa. Next. That's another one. In that film you saw of me, I'm putting one of these together. Since the film is in high contrast, you don't see the wire, so you see me put an object and it stays there, and another one, and I'm assembling the one that was just before this, and they seem to float in space, but they are held by this very fine, springy wire. Next slide. This was a culmination of my work with this tense wire. The piece is over 8 feet tall, a little over 8 feet tall. And you can see that this is about 5.5 feet. And the rod is a little thicker than you see it there. And of course it's balsa. What you can't see is that for this to stay upright, every shape that has a volume is hollow. Huh? So if it weren't, you know, the rod might sag or bend. And this, these small parts in the middle since they're on a long rod, they always shivered a little bit because, you know, the floor, the movement of the air would agitate them. And maybe that white ball at the top, too, would sway a little bit. There was an outdoor show, and I rented a studio in the building where Bert had a studio, and I made this piece is 8.5 feet tall to the top. I knocked out this piece in 17 days, I think, working so that my hands were bleeding at the end of the day. But it was very much noticed in the press and by the people. It was at the Tuileries Gardens. This was the second exhibition of new sculpture, de la jeune sculpture. 1950, huh? Next. This is more recent. In the 60s, it's a piece about 6 feet 8 inches, carving in wood, painted black. Next. Next slide, please. This is the same beam of redwood. It's called Walk, and it too is almost 7 feet tall. This is a bunch of pieces I'm working on that I assembled in the studio next to me, which is rather bare. My own place is filled up. And I'm working on them, and I just painted some of these, and the point is that they'll all be painted and stand on bases. Next slide, please. And I must say, during the last 10 years since a visit to Japan, I've been doing, I don't know how many hundreds of drawings, which I think of as sumie. That is, they're done on Japanese paper with Japanese ink and Japanese brush and some Japanese American feeling. Thank you.
I should mention that Sydney is also a scholar who has written books on Brancusi and Cézanne. And now our last speaker is Franz Freilich. Friedrich, I'm sorry.
Well, you didn't say why I'm here, but I will try to explain. I have a small gallery down in Tribeca, and well, I'll tell you how I happened to show all three of these gentlemen, artists, for whom I feel very privileged. And I must say that I learned a lot about their work actually watching the slides and listening to their discussion or description of their work. I really found it fascinating. But what I wanted to talk about a little bit is how I happened to have the show of Gallery Wheat artists. And it came about in a rather strange way, rather spontaneously in a way, but I happen to have known one of the artists who showed at Gallery Wheat, not someone who we have any documents here, but his name was Haywood Bill Rivers. And he was a good friend of mine, and he used to tell me about his life in Paris in those early days and so on. And he talked about Gallery Wheat. He was very involved in that in the very beginning of it. He was a good friend of Bob Rosenwald, and actually that was Bob Rosenwald's studio that became the Gallery Wheat. And Bill was a good friend of his, so that was part of it. But I showed some of Bill's work in one of my exhibits, And Sidney Geist came down, and we were sitting around chatting, and about that time. And I said, gee, I wonder if it would be possible to get some of these artists who showed there, get them together and have a show of their work. And Sidney said, well, call Bert Hasson, because he has some names and addresses of the artists who showed there. So I called Bert Hasson, and he sent over a list of addresses and so on. And we wrote letters to them. Not really, at this point, it was just sort of a vague idea that we had that it might be a possibility. But most of the people to whom we wrote answered and said they would be very interested in participating in a show. And it sort of grew from there. I mean, what people suggested other people, or they called them up, or in one case, I don't know how, by word of mouth, a guy called me up from Washington, D.C., and he said, well, my father was a painter in Paris in those days, and he showed at Gallery Wheat, and was there any chance of having him in the show? And I said, well, sure, if you send me, some slides and photographs of his work and so on. So that was how one other one came. And then a friend of Sidney Geist, Hugh Townley, who lives up in Vermont, apparently Sidney told him about the show, and he called me up and said, would it be possible to be in the show? So that's sort of how it grew, really mostly by word of mouth. And it ended up that I had 21 different artists, which for my relatively small gallery was quite a bit. And what we tried to ask the artists to do was to show one early work, if they had them, and one more recent work, to sort of show the transition or development of their work over the years. But I must say, seeing these slides, I think I have a better idea of what at least Bert and Jonah and Sidney's work, what they were doing, because we only did have 2 works of each one of the artists. So the only last thing I want to say is I don't, what is the word? I also had a Parisian romance. And I mean, I don't know what it was about Paris. I was not an artist. I'm not to this day an artist. But I was fascinated by the idea of Paris. And when I first got there, I was just incredibly touched or moved by the energy of the city. And also there's a kind of maverick, I don't know, there's a unique quality to French life, I think. And less so now, I think, than in the 1950s. I was there in the fall of 1951, actually. But anyway, I was fascinated, and I had my own love affair with Paris.
Thank you. I just want to ask a couple of questions of anyone who cares to answer it of the 4, and maybe you can pass around the mic. And then we'll leave it open to you. I know you all have a lot of questions. My first question was art school necessary in order to make it in this art world in Paris? Who wants to answer? Anybody? You want to say something?
Well, we were obliged, but the government said if you want the $75 a month to live on, you had to go to a school, register in a school. But most of us didn't even go to school. We'd go in the morning and we'd sign our name, and then we'd disappear to our hotel rooms or disappear to our studios if we had them. So that art schools were obligatory. The government would not allow us to receive our stipend without it. That is.
Thank you. Would you like to say anything? Yeah.
Well,
Go ahead, say it.
I had the feeling that you meant, was art school necessary in our previous education?
Exactly.
That's what I thought. No, nobody asked us. You had to just produce. You were accepted for an exhibition on the basis of what you did. Nobody asked us what art school we'd been to.
What about you, Jonah? Do you have something to say about it? Here, you have to.
About art school, before we went to
Was it
Paris?
necessary to be an artist? Today, everybody has to go to art school. You have to really plan your career. It's a very careerist.
Well, we were all on the GI Bill of Rights. We were all on the GI Bill of Rights. So, I mean, anybody who really wanted to go to Paris at the time, they were artists. They had been in the arts, and so, I mean, here was an opportunity to go there and really live like an artist. So that, we just chose our schools, and the government said, go ahead, do it, you know, that's about it. But I must add, for myself, I mean, I didn't learn too much from them. Truly, I didn't. And I liked the life there. I liked the cafe life. I liked meeting with the artists and the other Americans there. But personally, I don't think I learned too much. I learned more from going to Salon d'Automne or Salon de Mai and looking at what the other painters were doing in the galleries.
I knew a lot of the abstract expressionists, and a lot of the wives of the artists were actually teachers. I asked Elaine de Kooning once, what do you suggest to women artists? And she said, marry well. Why are there no women in this group?
There are.
Here, use the microphone.
There were some artists, but evidently we didn't get all the names together, you know. But in another sheet of paper, I think Franz had the name of one girl who complained about the fact that she wasn't included. But there were more than one, that's for sure.
Do you want to say anything?
Could I just?
The point of view is, it was, in those days, remember, that was, most of us were there because we had a stipend from the government, very little, and most of us were men because we had this stipend. The women in America didn't have any money, and they, coming over to Paris that way, there was no real incentive, although there were a few women, one of them who we invited to this show, who said she had only vague relationship with the gallery, and she's still living in Paris now. What's her name?
Shirley Jaffe.
Shirley Jaffe, right, Shirley Jaffe, and she's been living in Paris now for 50 years. But there were a few women who were in our Paris world at the time, but it was mostly men. And most of us had French girlfriends type of thing, so, or Swedish,
Cindy,
or
do you want to say anything?
Icelandic,
I'm
or-
sorry. Use the mic.
We were mostly ex-GIs, and most of the GIs were men.
Franz, do you want to add anything?
Well, no, I just was going to say that we did have one woman in the show,
Yeah.
Mariana Pineda,
Mariana Pineda.
the wife of Harold.
It's going to have a Tovish.
The wife of Harold Tovish, and also Shirley Jaffe, and then another woman, Faye Lansner, called me up shortly before we opened the show to say that she had been in the gallery, and why wasn't she represented? I said, this is the first I've heard of it. I'm sorry, that was the situation. It was too late to include her at that point.
She called me up too, Faye Lansner, claiming, you know, very upset and very hurt that she was not included. But there were so many people over that short period of time that we just couldn't keep track of everybody. I mean, we weren't just hanging around the gallery all the time and finding out who was showing. We didn't go to every opening. So there turned out to be an awful lot of people in that 2-year period. But of course, a lot of people I didn't even know. I mean, I look over the list of people who showed at the gallery, and a few that I know, but many of them I don't know.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question and then turn it over to the audience. Recently in Los Angeles, I went to a press party for the Lucian Freud show, which had come from the Tate, and I asked the curator, was Lucian influenced by his grandfather, Sigmund Freud, who was probably one of the most famous men of the 20th century? He said, absolutely not. He said his influence, which I disagreed with seeing the art, but his influences came from his peers. Who were your influences? Gorky, Mata, any of the people living in Paris at that time?
Well, the curious thing is, I must admit that I was quite confused when I was in Paris artistically. I mean, I was really confused because at one point I admired Marc Chagall, early Marc Chagall. The other part I admired Picasso. I admired other people who were less radical than Picasso, and I think of myself as being rather mixed up. I don't think that I knew what I was doing most of the time, and I was doing it, but I mean, I had no central core, no real core, and it seems to me very vague. I mean, I think I must admit, I didn't, as Sydney said, I didn't work as hard as Sydney. I spent a lot of most of my time in the cafes bullshitting, but but I really, when I look back at that epic, I find little core. I find a very great confusion. I mean, what I liked? I liked Lorjou, for example, who's unknown in this country. I liked people from a range like Andre Minot, who's utterly unknown here. Roger de Galard, who's unknown here. That my range was so varied and so great that there's no central core. And I did know some of the surrealists, however. I remember meeting Jacques Carol. I knew a few of the surrealists, and I had met during the war, I met Max Ernst. So there was a core of something there. There was substance, but I don't feel integrated. I mean, I look at the work of Sidney here, showing his work, and I feel a very kind of integrated personality, somebody who had a very integrated direction. And I'm really admirative of that, when I didn't have any direction, I feel. I don't know about Jonah, how you felt.
Well, let's ask him.
Yeah, hey, Jonah.
I was interested in Picasso, and I was interested in Braque, and the Soutine, a few others, and yeah, I was interested in a few of the other French painters who were not as famous as Picasso. But other than that, I was not moved by a lot of the paintings that I saw. As a matter of fact, Picasso there's only a few pictures that I really liked about his work, and the others I thought were just like gratuite pieces of work that didn't amount to very much for me.
Sydney, there's another mic down there.
Before going to Paris, that was 1949 for me, and I was 34 years old and became 35 there in April. I had a bit of experience before that, and I had been very much influenced when I was about 30 by Henry Moore. So much so that it took me years to get out from under it. And in Paris, I did get out from under it, I think, and I found myself in some way with a different background and opportunity to show, and I think there was a certain excitement that this little group of Americans stirred up among us. But I have maybe a cute little story about influence to tell you. I made these terracottas of which I showed you one, and Zadkin was rather scornful of them. Well, he was scornful of anything that Americans did. There was another sculptor, an American with a Japanese name. He was Japanese, Shinkichi Tajiri. And he so alienated him that Tajiri didn't come to class, and he alienated me too, but I had to go to class because I didn't have a studio. Shinkichi had a studio. So one day, as the model posed, I couldn't do anything in my usual manner, and I thought, well, let's see if I can do it like Zadkin. I had done nothing that looked Zadkinesque up to that point. I didn't like him. He didn't like me. So I did this piece that was very Zadkinesk. And as he came up to the piece, he said in English out loud, well, he talked most of the time in English. At last we see that this man has some intelligence.
We'll get to questions.
I remember that one of the big deals in the United States in American art, at least in New York, was the arrival of all the European artists that came over at the very end of the 30s, and certainly during the war years. They fled different places in Europe because they had to, and they came to New York in particular to practice their art, and that created this, or that really blew up the scene in New York and made it much more intense than it had been and larger, and it also brought this whole European influence into American art. So I think it's really interesting listening to all of you tonight to consider the idea of American artists going to Europe and absorbing all these European ideas a little after this huge exodus from Europe that all these European artists had made, and then what it must have been like for you when you returned back to the States in the early 1950s and mixed again with all of these European artists and the Americans that had not gone over. Tell us a little bit about what that period of time was like in, I guess, the early to mid-50s when you returned back to New York.
Well, I came back, when I came back in about 52 or so, I was, very isolated and more or less was doing things that I had been doing in Paris, more or less. And then for some reason I started to go to the Artists Club, and in its early days, and that was the revelation for me about really what was happening in the New York art world. I met a lot of my friends who I know for years and years, and still know, at the Artists Club. And in the 50s we had started, I was also involved with the 10th Street Galleries, March Gallery, and that epic of the, and with, there was Taninger and Aria and March Gallery, and so I remember the first three couple of years that I came back from Paris, that I was doing my own kind of thing, my own kind of work in my own place, and I didn't really know that much of what was going on around New York until I got involved with the Cedar Bar world and the club and the Artists Club world, which then I began to discover really what was going on and began to, in a way, participate much more in the artistic life of New York. But it was very strange back coming back because I had planned to make some money. I was broke. And I wanted to come back to America and make some money and then go right back to Paris. But it didn't work out that way because I couldn't get a job that easily, and I couldn't make money that easily. So it wasn't, that dream could not come true of going back, getting some dough in my pocket, and then going back to Paris. Didn't happen until a few years later I went back to Paris, only on a visit. So, I mean, I didn't know where I was when I came back from Paris. I was kind of in my own little world. Jonah?
He has a mic there.
Okay.
Well, when I got back, I mean, I don't think the Americans moved me very much in what they were showing. I still like the French. I still like Picasso, and I liked all the figures that I went to Paris for. I still liked, and there wasn't very much that I could really be influenced by. I just went ahead, and I was more influenced by what was going on in the Metropolitan Museum of Art than anything else. Here you go.
Being a sculptor, I was not influenced, I must say, by the what was going on in New York, which was mostly in the realm of painting. The strong figures were mostly painters. I became a friend of David Smith, whose work I admired enormously, but there was no way to be influenced by him, really, since I didn't weld and I couldn't make the kind of joinery and designs that he could in welding. So I admired the painters, the new painters, but they didn't have much effect on my work, I must say. Incidentally, when we left Paris, I mean, those years were the last good years of Paris. No, I must. We were working. It was exciting. There were young people from all over the world had bourses the way we did. Huh? There were people from Iceland, Norway, Turkey. You know, young people. I met them doing art. It was a very exciting moment. Surely, when I went back in the middle 50s, the town was dead and has been dead ever since.
Anybody have any other questions?
Isn't that something?
No. There's so many artists here now.
Molly, I could make a remark, not directly.
Take the mic.
Yeah, sorry. You know, as I mentioned, when I started organizing this show of Gallery Wheat artists, I really did it because I was just intrigued by the idea of getting back together guys who had shown at a small gallery in Paris 50 years before, or more than 50 years before. I mean, that just sort of intrigued me as an idea. But the more I got organized the show and thought about it and so on, I decided this was a moment in the history of American art in a way. It wasn't the same moment that was happening in New York, but it was, it had its own authenticity in a way as an aspect of American art. And to this day, I mean, the standard histories of art tend to say, well, in the 50s or in the late 40s and the 50s, you had abstract expressionism and nothing else was happening. That was the only thing that mattered. Well, I think there were other things going on that also mattered. And I would like to see that aspect of American art history explored.
I read today that Irving Sandler says abstract expressionism has to be dirty to be good. Okay, one last question from me. Do you keep up with the younger artists? At that time, Jack Youngerman was there and Rhea Pell. Do you keep up? Well, he's gone, but do you keep up with the younger artists, like, let's say, Matthew Barney with his show at the Guggenheim?
Well, I know about all these people. God, I know so many artists myself. I know so many, and that it's hard to me to pick out anybody. But I don't get around the way I used to, unfortunately, being in a wheelchair. But I used to go around a great deal. I don't know. There are particular artists of the last 50 years. I think one of the factors when you get kind of old, you no longer think in 5 years. You don't think in decades. You sometimes think in 20-year periods. And when you start thinking about the work that you really like, it consists of a whole large epics. I mean, I've always had a great liking for Bill de Kooning, for example. I think he's one of the great really American painters. I've liked certain works by Klein, and I've liked works by Rothko. But curiously enough, my favorite, in terms of my own work, is actually Gorky, who's the artist that I find I relate to the most. Now, Gorky has been dead a hell of a long time now. But I think Gorky is one of the great American painters, and I relate to him. Of all the people, I think I relate to him the most. So what we do when we hit a certain age is that we thinking in all these decades and epics, those artists that might touch us. I mean, there have been plenty that touched me in the past, that still touch me to a degree, but paramountly, I think of actually Gorky. I've liked Soutine a great deal, and other people, plenty of other people of the 20th century art that I've liked. but it's difficult to, I know about all these people. I know their work. I like some early Sam Francis, for example. There are a lot of people that I have feelings for, but it's Gorky who I like the most. I don't know why, but I like Gorky.
You want to add something?
I want to subtract something. I don't think much of Matthew Barney, and I don't think much of the spectacular shows that are being shown in the Brooklyn Museum and in other places. I think it's just it's a ruse. It's a way that the museum is going to collect some money, and they have no other thing to do but to make something spectacular. And the more spectacular they become, the more absurd they become. The Coons shows, the Damien Hirst shows, they are ridiculous. There's nothing to say about them. And the people who follow these people are just as ridiculous.
And what do you really think? No, I'm kidding, I'm kidding.
I used to think I saw every show in town, but I simply don't get around as much as I used to. And I must say that the art that interests me most is the art of my friends. I was a member of the Tanager Gallery. What they do interests me. The men that I knew at Gallery 8, their work interests me. The only younger artist that I've seen sometime that interests me is about 51 or 52 years old. Yeah. Mel Kendrick, a sculptor.
Yeah.
Otherwise, David Smith isn't making any new sculpture. So I like to look at the art of my friends.
Thank you. Franz, would you like the final word?
Where are we?
I think we're finished.
Okay.
Thank you all. This was a wonderful, informative evening. And go by and see his gallery at 18 Warren Street. And the art show is not still there, but he has several pieces by these artists, so it's a treat to go there.
Molly, can I put in a quick plug?
That's what I was hoping.
Yeah, we have some catalogs from that show. It shows the photographs of all of the artists, 21 different artists, and including, of course, Bert and Jonah and Sid. So if you're interested, they're for sale, $10. But they're quite a handsome catalog, I think. If you see it, you'll enjoy it. You'll be interested.
Thank you all for coming.